is in full public works mode. And there's going to be not only the temple building undergoing, but there's going to be a lot of other buildings that are happening. And the labor force, as we saw in the last chapter, we talked about the tens of thousands of men that were put to work. This would have been an incredibly prosperous time for Israel, for Jerusalem, for the city. I mean, when you think about it, it's great when there are huge public works undertakings. So there probably wasn't anyone that wanted to work, that couldn't work, that wouldn't prosper. And everything that goes along with that, not only in the construction trades and in all of that, but all of the things that would have been needed to support that, everybody was doing great. Everybody was in this time of prosperity. There was money in the kingdom. There was money in the coffers of the government, which is always a good thing, right? And so they were able to take and launch these particular programs. But not only would it have been a time of great prosperity as it pertained to the physical aspect or to the building up of the folks, but it would have also been a great time of spiritual focus. It would have been a great time for the people to really have this excitement and this expectation about there being a permanent building, a temple built to the God of Israel. This had been something that had been in the making, as we'll see, for over 400 years in order for them to get to a place where there was the establishment of God's house. This was a big deal. And so as they go to approach it, what we're going to see in the description and what we're going to see given to us is that while the building itself is not necessarily grand in its scope and size, it was in how it was lavished, in how it was put together, in what went into it because of who was going to dwell in it. And so we're going to see that there would have been this incredible move towards designing this in such a way that it would have hopefully risen to the level of being suitable for God to use. Now, over the years, we know that there's often been this attempt on man to make churches look really, really cool, right? I mean, there's been everything from what we've seen in Europe and the old cathedrals and these massive structures that were built. And it's man's attempt to impress God by honoring Him and to impress anyone that would come in. I mean, aren't you guys impressed when you walk into this place? Yeah, concrete tip-up works really good, right? You know, all the stained windows that we've talked about, painting on the outside so it would look... No. While God may not be overly impressed, I think that there's something to be said for man's heart and desire to want to say, you know what? We want the representation of God to be that which is awe-inspiring. And although it's not necessary, I don't believe, because God would want it. As a matter of fact, we know that He never even told David to build him a house. But at the same time, the greatest building that God has, the greatest and most magnificent structure that He wants to see happen on this planet, takes place in the heart of His servant. As we are His temple, the greatest and the most elaborate and the most magnificent takes place in our hearts, not in the structures of what are prepared. But it's still amazing to see what they put together. So look at verse 1 of chapter 6. It says, "And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." Now, it wasn't uncommon for them to date one major event based on another major event. And what we have here is the case of dating the starting of the temple in the midst of Solomon's reign based on when they left Egypt. Now, it's interesting because we can determine, based on the numbers that are given us here, a pretty good indication of when Israel departed Egypt. And the way that we're able to do that is that it's been widely accepted by scholars that Solomon's reign began in 971 BC, and it went through a period of about 913 BC. Now, I know we have a hard time with this because you got to think backwards. Right? I mean, it came down to the end of BC by bringing the numbers smaller, and then it went up in AD as we've moved out into our era and the time that we're in right now. But if we take that reign, we go 4 years into it, and by adding to backwards, if you will, 480 years, we can determine that the Exodus took place somewhere around 1447 BC. So it's a good dating of when this would have taken place. What's even more amazing, though, than trying to figure out the times and the dates is that the tabernacle that God had Moses build in the wilderness lasted for over 400 years as a tent structure, as a not permanent, but a movable structure that God had them build. So it's amazing to think that God's house continued on. It says now, the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. The vestibule in the front of the sanctuary of the house was 20 cubits long, and the width of the house and the width of the vestibule extended 10 cubits from the front of the house, and he made for the house windows with beveled frames. Now, a cubit, we have to make an assumption on. A cubit in ancient terms was about 18 inches long. And so you can do the math. I'm not going to do a whole lot of it here for you. But basically on that scale, we're looking at a building that's about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and about 45 feet high. The main structure. Not grand, not huge by ancient standards by any means. But again, it wasn't about the size as much as it was about how it was going to be ornated and how it was going to be set up for the presence of God. When we allow for the storage rooms that we'll see in a moment and the porches and along with the thickness of the walls, chances are the structure itself was about 110 feet long and about 75 feet wide. Now, what it does tell us, though, is from a scale standpoint, is that it was the same but twice the size as the tabernacle in its dimensions. And this is basically what we're looking at. When we start talking about the area of the temple, the area that we see going in through this section, including the Holy of Holies, is this area that has just been described to us. In a moment, we'll see some of the other areas that are being described. This area on the outside is the courtyard area out here. This is actually outside the structure. So kind of keep an eye on that for a minute. We'll see where it takes us. It says, against the wall of the temple, he built chambers all around, against the walls of the temple, all around the sanctuary and the inner sanctuary. Thus, he made side chambers all around it. The lowest chamber was 5 cubits wide, the middle was 6 cubits wide, and the third was 7 cubits wide, for he made narrow ledges around the outside of the temple, and the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone, finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. And so he's describing now these rooms here that are off to the side, these chambers that are on either side that were attached to and built onto it. But the thing that's amazing about this is that these guys had a little bit of practice working with stone. You know that little trip that they had when they hung out in Egypt for all those years? Right? These guys were incredible stonemasons. So incredible, so precise was their ability to be able to quarry stones that the stones were brought to the place of the temple and assembled in such a way that they didn't need any mortar, and that the seams, as they would come together where they were joined together, were so tight that you couldn't get a piece of paper, the thickness of a piece of paper between the joints. No hammers, no chisels, nothing was done. The blocks were made, and they were brought in and assembled precisely without any shaping having to take place on the Temple Mount. It says the doorway for the middle story was on the right side of the temple, and they went up by stairs to the middle story, and from the middle to the third. So he built the temple and finished it, and he paneled the temple with beams and boards of cedar. And he built the side chambers against the entire temple, each 5 cubits high. They were attached to the temple with cedar beams. Then the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this temple which you're building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. And I will dwell among the children of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. I think this is so cool. I think this is so much the nature of God. Here's Solomon. Now you got, again, imagine the buzz that's going on in Israel right now. Imagine what's happening. They're building the temple. All eyes, all focus, all industry, all the spirit of the... I mean, this had to be a time for Israel where they were just like so stoked as a people that it was absolutely insane. And yet, God shows up in the middle and says, oh, by the way, you know about that temple thing you're building for me? I don't want you to lose your focus. I don't want you to get distracted. Remember, what's more important than that temple thing that you're building over there is that you keep my statutes, that you walk in my commands, that you stay close with me. And guys, let me tell you, I remember at the time when we took over this building, I don't think there was hardly, was anybody here when we came into this building for the first time? Look at that. See, you guys got to go up and look at the archives, man, and look at the pictures. I mean, this place was a wreck. Okay? This was an industrial building that had been abandoned for like 4 years or more. The dust that was in here was incredible. When you walk through the place, I mean, it looked like Pigpen just walking through with the dust going up behind, you know? All right? Right where I'm standing right here was a solid concrete or cinder block filled, rebar enforced wall that went from here all the way up and then back over to the back. It was called a blast wall because the things that they did in here were that type of processes to where if something exploded, they didn't want it to kill all the people on the other side of the wall. You have no idea what it took to get this wall down, right? I mean, we're talking hours and hours and hours of steel cutting saws and jackhammers and a bunch of guys in here trying to stay out from underneath it when it fell over and those types of, and girls, right? And girls. And let me tell you what, the process by when we took the building over on Labor Day till we were in it for our first service on December 16th, I believe it was, of that year, it became really, really easy to lose focus. Because, man, everybody was going to work at their day job all day long, and then at night we would get together here, we'd order a couple of pizzas, and we would work till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. And everybody was here, and it was a crazy time. I mean, this place was a disaster, but yet we were just doing it for the Lord. And I can remember so often forgetting to pray. It's because we were doing so much for the Lord and at His direction, but at some point in time, it was as if He just had to continually remind us, don't forget. This is a good thing, but don't forget. And guys, we have to keep that in our minds and in our hearts. We can get too busy doing things for God, even directed by God, to where we stop paying attention to God. And that's what He wants first. And that's what He's telling Solomon right now. He says, hey, this is great, but don't lose your focus. Don't lose the purpose in what you're doing. So Solomon built the temple and he finished it. There you go. And he built the inside walls of the temple with cedar boards from the floor of the temple to the ceiling. He paneled the inside with wood, and he covered the floor of the temple with planks of cypress. Then he built a 20-cubit room at the rear of the temple from the floor to the ceiling with cedar boards, and he built it inside as an inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. And what we're talking about now is where this was all stone on the outside. He went in and he put paneling of cedar on the floor, planked it, and put wood all the way around. And then the Holy of Holies was wrapped completely also in all of this cedar and all of this planking that he put in cypress. He says, in front of the temple sanctuary was 40 cubits long, and inside the temple was a cedar carved with ornamental buds and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone to be seen. And so the picture, on the inside, you couldn't see any of the stonework. The stonework was only visible from the outside. And he prepared the inner sanctuary inside the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. He overlaid with pure gold and overlaid the altar of cedar. So Solomon overlaid the inside of the temple with pure gold. He stretched gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. The whole temple he overlaid with gold until he had finished all the temple. Also he overlaid with gold the entire altar that was by the inner sanctuary. So this is what we're looking at when we talk about the idea of everything being gold. Now picture, if you will, the inside of this is completely wooden. It has been carved decoratively and then overlaid with gold. And again, this is an artist's rendition, and we'll get back to it here in a minute. We'll be looking a little closer in different areas. But what you can see now is where the inside, the floor is wrapped in gold, the walls are gold. Everything within that chamber between the temple and the Holy of Holies is wrapped in pure gold. Inside the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. One wing of the cherubim was 5 cubits, and the other wing was 5 cubits. 10 cubits from tip to tip, one wing to the tip to the other. And then skipping ahead a little, it says that one wing touched the wall, and the other wing of the cherub touched the other wall. And so as we zoom in, and I know that's a little fuzzy, but what we're talking about now is these huge statuesque cherubim that are put within the Holy of Holies, to where the wingtips of each one of these are spanning, touching each other in the middle and touching the walls on either side. And it was considered at that point that the resting place of the ark was between these 2 cherubim within this room. It says, then he carved all the walls of the temple all around, both inner and outer sanctuaries, with carved figures of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. And the floor of the temple he overlaid with gold, both the inner and the outer sanctuaries. And for the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood. It was estimated that with everything that is described, with the size of it, with the implements and everything that was made, that somewhere in the neighborhood of 75,000 pounds of gold was in this temple. Now, we know going forward, when the temple was burned, did you ever wonder how they burnt the temple? It's like, well, it's stone and it was gold. How did it burn? Well, it also had a lot of cedar and cypress and wood underneath everything. But it was the reason why, when Rome came in and destroyed the temple and burned it, that they tore every single stone apart to get in between where all of the gold had melted. Because we're not talking about, there was a little bit of gold. Wouldn't the guys on Gold Rush like to hook into this kind of stuff? They're shooting for ounces, right? This was pounds. 75,000 pounds of gold is what's estimated went into this. Jumping ahead to verse 38. It says, in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details and according to all the plans. So he was, being Solomon, 7 years in building it. 7 years it took from the time that they started in order to complete the building of the temple. Look at what it says in verse 1 of chapter 7 as we move into 7. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. So he finished all his house. He also built a house of the forest of Lebanon. And then jump down to verse 6. He also made a hall of pillars, and the house where he dwelt, and another court inside the hall with like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as a wife. And all of these were of costly stones cut to size. Now, what we're talking about now is the temple area that also included Solomon's house. It also included this forest of Lebanon structure in this building here, the Hall of Pillars. And so here we have the temple area up on the top. We have a courtyard that comes down into what was Solomon's house. And what's interesting is that as elaborate as the temple was, Solomon's house was bigger and more elaborate. And it is kind of interesting because it is just kind of human nature for us to make sure that the houses that we live in are taken care of first, isn't it? He spent 7 years building the house of the Lord, and he spent twice that building his own house and making sure that it was as grand as what was there. Now, we could fade this by saying, well, of course, he was the king of Israel and he was the representation of God. If he's going to have people come in for a state dinner, or if he's going to entertain he's got to have this wonderful, grandiose place, right? Right. That's how that works. Here was Pharaoh's daughter's house that was tagged onto the back of his house. And we don't have a whole lot of detail on what it looked like, but from a size comparison, this is considered to be how it was arranged in these particular areas. Now Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre, and he was the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre. He was a bronze worker, and he was filled with wisdom and understanding and skill in working in all kinds of bronze work. So he came to King Solomon, and he did all of his work. And he cast 2 pillars of bronze, each one 18 cubits high, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference around each. Then he made 2 capitals of bronze, and he set them on the top of the pillar. So what it's referring to now are these items here, these pillars. And guys, I don't know if you can... They didn't have cranes, automated stuff. They didn't have heavy... I mean, this thing was not only huge, but bronze is very, very heavy. I mean, it's a heavy metal. Gold is not very light either. So all of the things that they were putting into this area are really fantastic in the aspect of just how it was that they were able to put all of this together, and in doing so, be able to not only create it, but also make it so ornate that it served as this grand. And the other thing that we'll see as we go on and we study the further down through the Bible, we're going to see that this temple paled in comparison to the next temple that's going to be built. But this was pretty fantastic. Picking up at verse 21, it says, "And he set up the pillars by the vestibule of the temple. And he set up the pillar on the right, and he called it Jachin. And he set up the pillar on the left, and he called its name Boaz." Now, Jachin means he shall establish, and Boaz means in his strength. And so, as with almost everything that we see, this picturesque aspect and there being significance to names, what they did was cast each of these, and then they named him, he shall establish in his strength, as the means of what was happening going into the temple. Pretty neat. Pretty significant. It says, "And he cast a sea of bronze, 10 cubits from one brim to the other, and it was completely round. Its height was 5 cubits, in a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference." Now this sea of bronze is this item that we see right here. And it was set upon, and it gives more dimensions and it talks more about it, but it was set on all of these bowls, and there were 3 facing in all 4 directions that were holding this thing up, and it was this huge bath-type structure that the priests would use the water that was contained within it in order to be able to wash, not only ceremoniously, but also to be able to wash through the process of the sacrifices. Chances are it had some sort of faucet-type fixtures on it. They didn't jump into it and take a bath, but what they did was use this as a huge aspect of being able to hold fresh and clean and what would have been considered consecrated water on site for the purposes of the priest. Moving on down into verse 27, it says, "He also made 10 carts of bronze." And again, we're skipping through this because it gives great detail on how the carts were built and how big they were and how big around the wheels were and all of that. You're happy to have you read that and go through that. It's interesting reading. We're just not going to labor that tonight as we move through this. But what they're talking about are these carts here, and there were 5 of them on each side of the temple. You can't see these except for the one peeking out of the corner here. But these also then had bowls on them, or they had lavers on them of bronze, and it says that they were able to hold 40 baths worth of water. So I don't know what 40 baths is, but I'm sure there's a way to calculate that. But they had quite a bit of water in them. And again, you have to remember, and we're going to see in just a little while, that what took place on the Temple Mount and out in the courtyard where the sacrifices were being made was a very, very dirty, bloody business. We're going to see in a minute the number of animals that were sacrificed for the dedication of this, and it's going to blow your mind. They had to be able to clean up. They had to be able to have water. They had to be able to wash down and to rinse down. And so these containers that they had that held water were very important to that process. In verse 40, it just also tells us that he made lavers and he made shovels and he made bowls. So all of the things that were outside of the temple, in the courtyard, the things that were being used for the preparation and for the sacrifice were made of bronze. Jumping down in verse 45, the second part, it says, "All of these articles which are made for the king, for the house of the Lord, were burnished bronze. In the plain of Jordan, the king had them cast in clay molds between Sukkoth and Zaretan. And Solomon did not weigh all of the articles because there were so many, the weight of the bronze was not determined." It weighed so much they couldn't figure it out. The weight of it was just so phenomenal and so incredible, there was no way for them to even know how much all of these things weighed. In verse 48 it says, "Thus Solomon had all the furnishings made for the house of the Lord, the altar of gold, and the table of gold on which was the showbread, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary, with the flowers and with the lamps and with the wick trimmers of gold, the basins and the trimmers, the bowls and the ladles, the censers of pure gold, and the hinges of gold, both of the doors in the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors of the main hall of the temple. All gold. Everything that we see, everything within this temple is completely wrapped in gold. And it's interesting because, and we could do a study just on this, okay? The difference in the significance of what was going on in the outer court with the bronze as compared to what was going on inside the temple in the Holy of Holies as it being in gold. Just as a quick Cliff Notes version, bronze speaks of redemption. Bronze speaks of this aspect of there needing to be redemption. The things that were handled, the redemption that took place, the things that happened out here take place in this area of judgment. This need for redemption is based on the judgment of God. And judgment through the symbol of the bronze was taking place all and around the outside of what was happening in the courtyard here. The judgment of God and the need for redemption was signified outside the temple by the virtue of all of these bronze items. And then, when you enter into the presence of God, when you enter inside, everything becomes pure. Everything becomes gold, which is the picture of heaven. And so, if you really want to just kind of look at the temple and see what was going on, everything out here meant you were dead. And you needed a sacrifice. And in here, where the place where God dwells, is the place of peace with God. Now, the cool thing about it is that we know in our generation, because in here, only the priests were allowed to go inside here, and only the high priest one time a year was able to go into the most holies, the Holy of Holies, and he would go in and make atonement for the people. And so concerned were they about getting this right, that they would take, and not only did they have bells on the robe of the priest so that they could hear if he was still moving in there, but they would tie a rope around his ankle, and they would send him in there and hope that he got it right, because if he didn't, he'd be struck dead. They couldn't go in to get him out, so if he fell down, they didn't hear the bells ringing, they'd jerk on the rope and drag his body out. This was Israel's understanding of entering into the presence of God. Guys, when Jesus Christ resurrected, we know that the veil, the canvas that held off the people from the presence of God, what was taking place in the Holy of Holies, was rent. It was ripped from the top to the bottom. It was opened up and it was laid wide open so that we have access to the very glory of God through Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. There's no longer this need for us to worry about approaching or having anyone else approach God on our behalf, or that we can't be in the presence of God. Again, it's not because of what we've done. Just as the priest knew that he was not worthy to go into that area, we know we're not worthy, but we're, by faith, made righteous through the one who was. And that's the aspect of what was going on that is so different in our lives now as compared to what was happening for them. It says in verse 51, so all the work that King Solomon had done for the house of the Lord was finished, and Solomon brought the things in which his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he put them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. And so now it's been 7 years. The other projects are most likely running simultaneously, so there was an additional period where they're working on Solomon's house. But the temple is completed, and now it's time. They bring in all of the things that David had set aside and established, the implements and the things that were there, they brought over into the treasury. All the leftover gold, there was a lot of stuff left over, even though they used a lot, were brought into the treasury. And now it's time for Solomon to start setting up to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the Holy of Holies and to start making the dedication of this building. So let's look at what it says in chapter 8, verse 1. We're doing great, man. We're already through 2 chapters. We're working on chapter 8. We're going to slow down. So Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all of the heads of the tribes and the chief fathers of the children of Israel to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is in Zion. So they're going to now relocate the Ark of the Covenant from inside the tabernacle, and they're going to go ahead and bring it into its permanent dwelling place in the Holy of Holies inside the temple. Therefore all the men of Israel assembled with King Solomon at the feast in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. So all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. And they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tabernacle of meeting, and the holy furnishings that were in the tabernacle. And the priests and the Levites brought them up. So King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be counted or numbered for multitude. Now, they're going to put a number to this in a little bit on what they did as a peace offering and what they did as the dedication. But at this particular point in time, when you see the numbers that they'll identify later, I'm thinking this number was more because they didn't write it down. If they counted the other ones, and you're going to see that they're just like so off the charts that it's amazing, this was even more so because it was so many that they couldn't count them. Those guys that are way smarter than I am when it comes to figuring things out have estimated that the elders and the men that would have been required to come to this dedication, to come to this feast, would have been somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 million men. Now, Israel and Jerusalem is not that big. I mean, when you think about it, the size of like New Jersey is what we're talking about in relationship to the area. Now think about if 1 million men showed up, they probably also brought with them wives and children and things of that nature. So we're talking about an incredible influx of people that would have come in for this particular event. But can you imagine what it would look like to have 1 million men bringing each one with them a sacrifice? Pretty crazy, isn't it? Then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord into its place, into the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their 2 wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. The poles extended so that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place in front of the inner sanctuary, but could not be seen from the outside, and they are there to this day. Now, being there to this day means to the day of this writing. Okay, it means that on the day that this guy wrote this, the temple was still standing and the poles were still there. But what they're talking about is that when the Ark of the Covenant was set into place in this area, we all remember that these poles were the only way that the ark was supposed to be carried, and that they were wooden poles that were overlaid with gold, and they would be put in through the sides of the ark, and the priests would put them on their shoulders, and they would carry these. These poles were removed in such a way that the ends of these poles were made to be visible through what was either a curtain or the open aspect of where the Holy of Holies were. Just the ends of them. So if you were inside the temple, you could look up and see that the poles that had once carried the Ark of the Covenant were still there. Look at what it says going on, though. It says, "But nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb, when the Lord made the covenant with the children of Israel, when they came out of the land of Egypt." Anybody want to guess what's missing? What used to be in the Ark of the Covenant? The what? The rod, Aaron's rod, right? What else? A golden jar of manna. Yeah, the tablets were in there, but there was a golden jar of manna, and there was Aaron's rod, which had budded in the wilderness that identified him as God's man to be the high priest. You remember? All right? And so at some point in time, we know that the Ark of the Covenant, because of some unscrupulous priests, got out of the control of Israel and went over to the Philistines for a while. And while it was in captivity, they must have at some point in time pilfered what was in there. They didn't dare touch the law, or by the time that they got to reaching in there, it's kind of like one of those Indiana Jones things, opening up the Ark of the Covenant, But they got the gold jar of manna out, or somebody did, and also Aaron's rod was now missing at this point in time that the Ark of the Covenant is put within the Holy of Holies. The only thing that is inside is the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments. And Solomon spoke. The Lord said that he would dwell in the dark cloud. I have surely built you an exalted house and placed for you a place for you to dwell in forever. I got to back up. Go to verse 10. I jumped to verse 12. And it came to pass that when the priests came out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. The terminology, or what we've come to know this as, is the kabod of God, or the Shekinah glory. It's that actual physical presence that's represented by the cloud, or by smoke, or by vapor, or by whatever we want to try to imagine it to be. That is the actual physical presence of God. And I think what's funny is that, and again, I go places that I can't back up in Scripture in my mind. Okay, so just stay with me here as I kind of free range a little bit. I'm thinking the priests are really full of themselves at this point in time. They got a new church. They got a great church. This place is fabulous, right? They brought in the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? They set the Ark of the Covenant in place. I'm sure the priests are like high-fiving. They are looking at each other like, man, we are so on top of this. This is so cool. We've got this going. God decides to show up, and He shows up so heavy that He runs them out of the room. I like that. I mean, God's presence comes in and dwells and is in this place so heavy that they can't do what they want to do in the serving of the Lord. It just literally runs them right out of the temple. I think that's a great picture. And I think it's a great picture of, at some point in time, I think that possibly that they were trying to hone in a little bit on God's glory. And He wasn't going to let it happen. Let me show you what happens when I come into a room. I like it. And Solomon then spoke and said that he would dwell in the dark cloud. And surely I've built an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. Then the king turned around and he blessed the whole assembly of Israel while all the assembly of Israel was standing. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who spoke with His mouth to my father David, and with His hands has fulfilled it, saying, Since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I have chosen no city from any tribe of Israel in which to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now, it was in the heart of my father David to build a temple for the name of the Lord God of Israel. But the Lord said to my father David, Whereas it was in your heart to build a temple for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Nevertheless, you shall not build the temple, but your son who will come from your body, he shall build the temple for my name. So the Lord has fulfilled His word which He spoke, and I have filled the position of my father David, and sit on the throne of Israel, and as the Lord promised, and I have built a temple for the name of the Lord God of Israel. And there I have made a place for the ark, in which the covenant of the Lord, which He made with our fathers when He brought them out of the land of Egypt. So Solomon now is talking about how God has honored His promise. Remember, David went to the Lord and he said, I'm going to build you a house. I'm dwelling in this house of cedar. He had a wood palace at that point in time. And he said, I'm living in these great digs, and I look outside, and here's the Ark of the Covenant. Here's God's presence. Here's God's law, that which was given to us and is dwelling in a tent. I'm going to build a house for God. He called the prophet in, remember, and he called Nathan and said, Nathan, I'm going to build you a new church. And Nathan was like all down with it. Okay, man, this is great. Yeah, how big are you going to build it? This is going to be fabulous. Nathan goes home that night, and the Lord shows up. Nathan, go tell David he can't do that. Ooh. As a pastor, it's like, ooh, what do you mean? He's going to build a new church. He's going to build a new building. It's going to be fantastic. He's going to be... Go tell David that he can't build this because he's a man of war and he's got blood on his hands, and he cannot be the one that would build a dwelling place for me. Now, Solomon treats his dad pretty good here when he's talking to the people. Oh, my father had it in his heart, and the Lord said it's good that you have it in your heart, but it won't be you, it'll be your son. He didn't say because my dad was a man of war and he had too much blood on his hands and he couldn't prepare it because of the things that he had done in his life that dishonored the Lord, even though he remained a man after God's heart. Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and he spread out his hands towards heaven and he said, Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven or above or on the earth below like you, who keep your covenant and mercy with your servants who walk before you with all their hearts. You have kept what you promised your servant David, my father. You have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled it with your hands as it is this day. Therefore, Lord God of Israel, now keep what you promised your servant David, my father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man sit before me on the throne of Israel. Only if your sons take heed to their way, that they walk before me as you have walked before me. And now I pray, O God of Israel, let your word come true, which you have spoken to your servant David, my father. But now listen. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? Yet regard the prayer of your servant and his supplication, O Lord my God, and listen to the cry and the prayer which your servant is praying before you today, that your eyes may be open toward this temple night and day, towards this place of which you said, my name shall be there, that you may hear the prayer which your servant makes towards this place. And may you hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place, here in heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, listen, forgive. I like that. At this point in time, Solomon has got an incredible grasp of God. All right? Now, he has just built this fabulous temple. He has made it to the best possible standards that he could possibly implore. Perfectly cut stones, everything inside wrapped with pure gold, everything outside made perfect. I mean, this has got to be just like the crowning achievement of his life and vicariously the life of David before him. And yet he says, this is not anything that could even contain you. This is not anything that's worthy of you, but with our best effort, as we would come here to worship you, as we would use this as the means by which we would come and place our hearts before you, would you then please keep your eye, keep your ear, keep your focus and attention on your people, and as we come to worship you, as we come to sacrifice, forgive. What a great concept of what church is all about. I mean, we can't hold this place up and say, God, look at this wonderful building we built for you here. This is fabulous, isn't it? I mean, look at this place. I'm impressed with it. God gave us a place to be able to meet in His name. But our heart needs to be wherever we would assemble. Then, Lord, take and let us draw your attention because of who you are, not because of who we are. And then by all means, forgive. Forgive. Then Solomon does some things that I think are absolutely incredible in these last few verses, and we're going to go through them kind of quick. Is he starts talking about how it is that God and this symbol of the temple are going to be the guiding and directing forces for the nation of Israel as it pertains. Well, let's just see what he says. He says, and when anyone sins against his neighbor and is forced to take an oath and comes and takes an oath before you, your altar in this temple, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the wicked, bringing his way upon his head, and justifying the righteous by giving him according to his righteousness. What Solomon just said is we want the temple and we want God's presence and God's judgment to be the head of our court system. The system of righteousness. Wouldn't it be great if our Supreme Court recognized God first before they made some of the bonehead decisions that they make? He says the temple, the worship of God, the establishment of God's things is going to be what determines righteousness. And God, you judge. You be the righteous one, not a bunch of folks sitting on a jury panel trying to act like God. And when your people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against you, and when they turn their back to you, or turn back to you and confess your name and pray and make supplication to you in this temple, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them back to the land which you gave their fathers. He's talking about foreign policy. He's talking about how we would deal with an aggressive enemy that would come and knock down the Twin Towers. He's talking about how we would deal with an aggressive enemy that would come and that would attack us. And the basis for that attack, you notice what he said the basis of it was? When your people sin and suffer attack. And when the heavens are shut up and there's no rain because they have sinned against you. And when they pray towards this place and confess your name and turn from their sin because you afflict them, then hear from heaven and forgive the sin of your servants, your people Israel, that you may teach them the good way in which they should walk, and send rain on your land, which you have given to your people as an inheritance. In the times of economic downturn, in the times of depression, you see, that's what a lack of rain would have done to these people. An agrarian culture, if you don't have rain, you don't have food. You don't have resources. You don't have commodities. If you don't have commodities, the stock market crashes. And he says, when they sin and you bring calamity because you allow the economy to crash and burn, and then they come back and they confess their sin and they come and they recognize you, forgive and be gracious to them. And when there's famine in the land, pestilence or blight or mildew or locusts or grasshoppers, when their enemy besieges them in the land of their cities, whatever plague or whatever sickness is there, whatever prayer, whatever supplication is made by anyone or by all your people Israel, when each one knows the plague of his own heart and spreads out his hands towards this temple, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and forgive and act and give to everyone according to all his ways, whose heart you know, for you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land which you gave to our fathers. Famine, disease, pestilence, plague, Ebola, measles, natural disasters, pestilence, famine. Again, I think it's amazing how all of these calamities are preceded by the people's sin, not just natural causes. Moreover, concerning a foreigner who is not of your people Israel, but has come from a far country for your name's sake, for they will hear of your great name and your strong hand and your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays towards this temple, hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, that all peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, and that they may know that this temple which I have built is called by your name. That would be called immigration. That's what it is. Gee, do you see how we're kind of maybe missing the boat on these major things that we're dealing with because we're failing to acknowledge God? When they sin against you, listen, I love this. For there is no one who does not sin. Gee, I thought that was just a New Testament premise. Oh, well, here it is in the Old Testament. And you become angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and they take them captive in a land of the enemy, far or near. Yet when they come to themselves in the land which they are carried captive, and repent and make supplication to you in the land of those who took them captive, saying, we have sinned and done wrong, we have committed wickedness, and when they return to you with all their heart and with all their soul, and in the land of their enemies who led them away captive, and pray to you towards their land which you gave to their fathers, the cities which you have chosen, and the temple which I have built for your name, then, hear in heaven your dwelling place, their prayer and their supplication, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions which the people are, which they have transgressed against you, and grant them compassion before those who took them captive, that they may have compassion on them, for they are your people and your inheritance, whom you brought out of Egypt, out of the iron furnace, that your eyes may be open to the supplication of your servants and the supplication of your people Israel, to listen to them whenever they call to you, for you separated them from among the people of the earth to be your inheritance, as you spoke by your servant Moses when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord God. Folks, I hate to admit it, but we're being held captive in a foreign land. We are. We're captive right here to the foreign things that are taking place, the things that are turning away from God. And so there's a principle here that says, you know what? When we recognize, when we come to the point when we will humble ourselves and call on the name of the Lord, there's not only a potential, but there's the promise of Him hearing from heaven and healing our land. If we'll get serious about calling. How bad is it going to have to get? I don't know. I think it's going to have to get worse because we're still trying to fix it on our own without Him. Solomon then moves in verse 54 of this chapter, and he starts speaking a prayer of blessing over the assembly. And he says, "And so it was when Solomon had finished praying this prayer of supplication to the Lord, and he arose from before the altar of the Lord, from kneeling on his knees with his hands he spread towards heaven. And then he stood and blessed all the assembly of Israel with a loud voice, saying, Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to His people Israel, according to all that He promised. There has not failed one word of all His good promise, which He promised through His servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as He is with our fathers. May He not leave us or forsake us, that He may incline our hearts to Himself, to walk in all of His ways, to keep His commandments and His statutes and His judgments, which He commanded our fathers. And may these words of mine, with which I have made supplication before the Lord, be near the Lord our God day and night, that He may maintain the cause of His servant and cause of His people Israel, as each day may require, that all the people of the earth may know that the Lord is God. There is no other. Let our hearts therefore be loyal to the Lord our God, to walk in His statutes and keep His commandments as at this day." And then the dedication, and we'll close with this. Then King Solomon and all of Israel took him with him, offered sacrifices before the Lord. And Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered to the Lord, 22,000 bulls, 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. On the same day, the king consecrated the middle of the court that was in front of the house of the Lord, for there he offered burnt offerings, grain offerings, and the fat of peace offerings, because the bronze altar that was before the Lord was too small to receive the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, and the fat of the peace offerings. And at that time Solomon held a feast, and all of Israel with him, a great assembly, from the entrance of Hamath to the brook of Egypt, before the Lord our God, 7 days and 7 days more, 14 days. And on the 8th day he sent the people away, and they blessed the king, and they went to their tents, joyful and glad of heart for all of the good that the Lord had done for His servant David and for His people Israel.